My dad and my mother was in the theater, and my father still is in the business. Of course, my mother gave up her career when she married. But, yeah. But they never encouraged me to go on.
There was a moment, somewhere around 1965, when it looked like nothing could stop Joey Heatherton. She was 20 years old, already a Broadway veteran, already a familiar face on national television, already being marketed by a movie studio as the young star of the year. She could sing. She could dance better than almost anyone else working in Hollywood at the time. She had the kind of camera presence that studio executives spend careers trying to manufacture and almost never succeed. And then, within a handful of years, the leading roles simply stopped coming. Not because her talent faded. Not because audiences turned on her. It happened because of something a man she married did to a child he had never met, a crime Joey Heatherton had no part in, no knowledge of, and no ability to stop. This is the story of how a scandal that belonged entirely to someone else ended up rewriting her future, and why the industry that once called her a star chose to punish her for a decision that was never hers to answer for. Joey Heatherton was born Davani Johanna Heatherton on September 14, 1944, in Rockville Center, a town on Long Island just outside New York City. Show business wasn't something she discovered later in life. It was the family trade. Her father, Ray Heatherton, had spent years performing on Broadway before reinventing himself as a beloved children's television host, best known for a long-running local program called The Merry Mailman. For an entire generation of New York kids, Ray Heatherton's warm, gentle presence on the screen was part of growing up. Joey grew up watching her father go to work in front of a camera, the same way other children watched their fathers head off to an office or a factory floor. That environment shaped her early and completely. She trained seriously in ballet from a young age, developed a singing voice with real range and control, and picked up the instincts that most performers spend a decade trying to learn: how to hold a room, how to time a laugh, how to sell a song to the back row. By the time she was 15, she wasn't just taking lessons anymore. She had landed a spot in the original Broadway production of The Sound of Music, working as both an ensemble member and an understudy. It was a serious professional credential for someone barely into her teenage years, and it gave her a front-row seat to how a hit show actually runs, the discipline, the repetition, the professionalism required to keep a production alive night after night. Television found her soon after. She became a recurring presence on The Perry Como Show, playing a bubbly teenager with an obvious, comic crush on the show's much older host. It was a small piece of the show, but it did exactly what it needed to do. It put her face in front of a much larger audience than Broadway could ever reach, and it proved she had the timing and warmth to carry a bit on live television. Through the early 1960s, Heatherton kept adding credits at a pace that suggested a young performer with real momentum behind her. She took dramatic guest roles on respected television series of the era, including Route 66, The Virginian, The Nurses, and Mr. Novak, parts that demanded more than the light charm of a variety segment, and she handled them capably. Her film career opened with real weight behind it. In 1963, she appeared in Twilight of Honor alongside Richard Chamberlain, playing a fragile, complicated young woman in a role that asked for genuine dramatic range. A year later, she shared the screen with two of the biggest actresses in America, Bette Davis and Susan Hayward, in the glossy melodrama Where Love Has Gone, based on a best-selling novel and positioned as a major studio release. Then, in 1965, she starred opposite Troy Donahue in My Blood Runs Cold, and the studio's marketing leaned hard into her potential, openly billing her as the year's breakout star. It wasn't subtle. It was a public statement from the industry that Joey Heatherton was being groomed for something much bigger. At the same time, she was becoming one of the most reliably dazzling live performers of her generation. She was a frequent guest on the biggest variety programs on television, including Dean Martin's and Ed Sullivan's shows, where her dancing, athletic, precise, unmistakably sensual, became something of a signature. Her voice could move from a hushed, intimate register to a full, commanding belt within a single line, and audiences responded to that range instinctively. Advertisers noticed too. She became the face of campaigns for RC Cola, and most memorably, the long-running spokesperson for Serta's perfect sleeper mattress commercials, ads that mixed playfulness with a wink of glamour and stayed lodged in American pop culture memory for decades afterward, long after most of her films had left theaters. She also spent years touring with Bob Hope's USO shows, performing for American troops during the Vietnam War, often under difficult and occasionally dangerous conditions. Soldiers loved her, and the experience only deepened her public image as someone glamorous, but also genuinely game, willing to put in the work, not just enjoy the applause. By the time the 1960s were drawing to a close, Joey Heatherton had built an unusually complete resume for someone still in her 20s. Broadway pedigree, dramatic film credits opposite major stars, a growing television reputation, a commanding live stage presence, and a recognizable commercial identity. Every signal pointed toward a much bigger act still to come. Then she met Lance Rentzel, and the story took a hard turn. Lance Rentzel was, by any measure, one of the most exciting players in professional football at the time. A wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys, he had speed, a flair for clutch catches, and a personality that thrived on attention. He and Heatherton met in Los Angeles and moved fast, engaged after only about 5 weeks of dating. In April 1969, they married at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, a wedding that drew heavy coverage from both the entertainment press and the sports press. On paper, it looked like the perfect pairing of two rising American stars from two very different worlds, Hollywood glamour meeting NFL stardom. Heatherton, by most accounts, threw herself into the relationship. She scaled back the intensity of her film pursuits to focus on her marriage, though she kept working television spots, live performances, the occasional appearance, while quietly setting aside the sustained push toward major film stardom that had defined the previous several years. Rentzel, for his part, seemed to relish having a famous, glamorous wife at his side, and the two were frequently framed in the press as a golden couple living at the crossroads of sports and show business. But underneath the polished public image, there were already serious problems. In November 1970, a little over a year and a half into the marriage, Rentzel was arrested in the Dallas suburb of University Park on a felony charge of indecent exposure. He had exposed himself to a 10-year-old girl playing in her own front yard. The story broke fast, moving from local Dallas news to national headlines within days. Heatherton initially tried to stand by him publicly, saying she wanted to remain supportive even as she struggled to understand what had happened. Then it got worse. Reporters digging into Rentzel's past uncovered a nearly identical incident from 1966 while he was still playing for the Minnesota Vikings, a case that had quietly been reduced to a lesser charge of disorderly conduct, with Rentzel ordered into psychiatric treatment rather than facing a formal sentence. The revelation of a prior offense changed the entire framing of the story. This wasn't an isolated lapse anymore. It was a pattern, and the public reaction shifted accordingly. Whatever sympathy had existed for the couple largely evaporated, and the golden couple narrative collapsed almost overnight. For Joey, the position she found herself in was uniquely painful. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't known. But because she was his wife, his crime became, in the public's mind, at least partly her story too. The pressure on the marriage became unbearable, and in the fall of 1971, she filed for divorce. The marriage was formally dissolved in 1972. She later described the entire episode as one of the most psychologically difficult periods of her life, and people close to her at the time have suggested she never fully shook off the shock of discovering the full extent of what her husband had done, not once, but twice. What's important to hold on to here is simple. Joey Heatherton committed no crime. She wasn't present. She wasn't complicit. She wasn't even aware of the earlier incident until reporters uncovered it. And yet, because her name was legally and publicly tied to his, the industry that had spent years building her up began treating her as though she were somehow implicated in a scandal that was entirely his. The legal resolution for Rentzel himself was fairly contained. He pleaded guilty, received a suspended sentence, and was ordered into psychiatric treatment. The NFL placed him on its inactive list for a period, and his football career absorbed real damage, though he did eventually return to play. But the consequences for Joey Heatherton's film career turned out to be far more severe and far more permanent. Hollywood in the early 1970s still operated under a rigid, largely unspoken code about public image and moral association, and that code applied very differently depending on gender. Male stars caught up in personal scandals could often wait things out. Enough time, the right public relations strategy, and a few carefully chosen roles could rebuild a reputation. Women linked to scandals involving children, even purely through marriage, and through no fault of their own, faced a far less forgiving calculation. Studios grew skittish. Casting directors, worried about risk and perception rather than talent, quietly began passing her over. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The career trajectory that had carried her through 3 significant studio films in the mid-1960s simply stalled. She did appear in one more major theatrical release during this period, Bluebeard, in 1972, opposite Richard Burton, but the production was troubled from the start, and the finished film landed as both a critical and commercial disappointment. There's some debate among those who've studied her career about exactly how the timing of that shoot lined up with the peak of the scandal, but functionally, Blue Beard marked the end of her run as a leading lady in major studio pictures. When she returned to feature films years later, it was in a very different kind of production. The Happy Hooker Goes to Washington in 1977, a low-budget sex comedy that few critics took seriously as a piece of filmmaking. The gap between that role and her earlier work alongside Bette Davis, Susan Hayward, and Richard Chamberlain was stark, and industry observers at the time noted it plainly. If this was the caliber of material still being offered to her, the era of Joey Heatherton as a conventional leading lady was effectively over. What's striking, though, is that everywhere else, her career kept moving. Music remained receptive to her. She released the Joey Heatherton album in 1972 and scored a modest hit with the single Gone, which climbed to number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100. She continued to headline in Las Vegas, sharing marquees with major names like Tony Bennett, and audiences kept showing up. The Serta commercials kept running, cementing her image in American living rooms well past the point where her film career had cooled. She stayed a regular presence on television variety programming, and in 1975, she even co-starred with her father in a short-lived CBS summer series called Joey and Dad. The pattern here is hard to miss. Music, nightclub work, commercials, and television all still had room for Joey Heatherton. Feature films largely did not. Her husband's crime hadn't touched her actual ability to perform. It had simply closed off one specific, prestigious lane of opportunity that had once seemed wide open in front of her. The 1980s brought a rougher set of challenges, separate from the scandal, but compounding its long shadow. By this point, the momentum of her earlier career had faded considerably, though she never stopped working. Cabaret and music remained her professional core, and television still offered occasional opportunities, including a memorable guest turn on Laverne and Shirley in an episode titled Night at the Awards. But substantial film work and significant dramatic television roles had become scarce, and the industry by then had largely moved on to a new generation of performers. Her personal life also became more turbulent and more publicly scrutinized during this stretch. In 1985, she was arrested following an altercation at a passport office in Manhattan, where a clerk accused her of slapping and pulling her hair during a dispute over travel documents. Heatherton maintained she had been mishandled by security. The case went to civil trial, and a jury ultimately awarded the clerk a modest sum on a negligence claim while rejecting the more serious assault allegations, a far messier and more ambiguous outcome than the tabloid headlines suggested, but the negative press landed regardless. That same year, she also faced a separate legal dispute over an unpaid hotel and spa bill. Then, in 1986, she was arrested again after a physical confrontation with her former boyfriend and manager, Jerry Fisher, during which she stabbed him in the hand with a steak knife. Fisher later dropped the charge, and a related possession charge against her was dismissed on technical grounds. None of this helped a career already fighting an uphill battle. Each new headline added another layer of distance between Joey Heatherton and the polished young star the public had known in the 1960s, making any real professional comeback that much harder to engineer. Still, she kept showing up. In 1990, filmmaker John Waters, known for casting performers whose public reputations carried some kind of complexity or notoriety, gave her a supporting role as a religious zealot in his cult musical comedy Cry Baby. It was a small part, but a real return to a theatrical film with genuine cultural visibility, and proof that she could still catch the interest of filmmakers willing to work outside the traditional studio system. It didn't, however, lead to a wave of new film offers. Opportunities stayed limited. In 1997, at 53, she posed nude for Playboy, a move widely read as an attempt to generate fresh attention and perhaps pry open doors that had been closed for years. It got attention, but not much career traction. That same year, her father Ray passed away, and the timing prompted some unfortunate, tasteless speculation in parts of the press, speculation that had no factual basis whatsoever. By the close of the decade, her story had become one of quiet persistence in the face of repeated setbacks, a performer who kept working through disappointment, legal trouble, and relentless public scrutiny, without ever fully vanishing from the entertainment world. Just staying visible had, by that point, become its own kind of accomplishment. What makes Joey Heatherton's story worth revisiting isn't just the sequence of events, it's the glaring double standard sitting underneath all of it. Lance Rensel's crime was serious, and the public condemnation he faced was entirely warranted. He had exposed himself to a child twice, and there's no defensible version of events where that gets minimized. But the professional cost of that crime landed disproportionately on the woman who eventually divorced him, a woman who had no involvement in the offense whatsoever. Her only connection to any of it was the marriage certificate. Male performers of that same era regularly survived personal scandals of their own and, given enough time, worked their way back into major roles. Their public identity could usually be separated from their private conduct, especially with the right PR strategy and a bit of patience from the industry. Women who found themselves linked to scandals involving sexual misconduct, even indirectly, even purely by marriage, often didn't get that same grace. Doors could close permanently, and the line between a woman's own conduct and her husband's could blur until it barely existed in the public's mind at all. Heatherton's experience is one of the clearest examples of how quickly a woman's professional identity could be rewritten by a man's actions in that era. Before the scandal, she was viewed as a rising performer with the full package: beauty, musical talent, danceability, television experience, everything needed to build a real film career. None of that disappeared afterward. What changed was simply the lens the industry chose to view her through. It's also worth pointing out how durable her talent actually was outside of film. While studios grew cautious, nightclub audiences and television viewers kept responding to her with real enthusiasm. The Serta ads alone kept her face and voice familiar to millions of households for years after the scandal had faded from front-page news. Her Vegas shows kept proving night after night that the core of what had made her a star in the first place, the energy, the stage command, the voice, hadn't gone anywhere. So the real loss here isn't that Joey Heatherton stopped working. She didn't. The real loss is that one specific path, sustained prestige-level film stardom, the exact trajectory that had looked so promising in the mid-1960s, was closed off to her because of who she happened to be married to, not because of anything she had done or any decline in her ability to draw an audience. There's a quieter final chapter here, too. After the Playboy spread and the crybaby role, Heatherton largely withdrew from public life, reportedly settling into a private existence in the Los Angeles area. Unlike a number of her contemporaries, she never pursued a big, carefully managed late-career comeback narrative or a string of nostalgic interviews designed to reshape how people remembered her. That choice to stay out of the frame has, in its own way, become part of the story. A performer who once filled stages and magazine covers with restless energy eventually chose to step back from the spotlight almost entirely. It's tempting to tell Joey Heatherton's story as a simple arc: rising star, scandal, collapse. But that framing skips over most of what actually happened. She wasn't just someone who became famous and then disappeared. She was a genuinely versatile performer who could sing, dance, act, work a live crowd, and sell a product on camera. And she kept doing all of those things for decades after the scandal that supposedly ended her. What the scandal actually took from her wasn't her talent, her work ethic, or her ability to hold an audience's attention. It took a specific opportunity, the chance to find out just how far a genuinely gifted young performer could have gone in feature films if her professional path had been allowed to develop on its own terms, rather than being redirected by a crime she had absolutely nothing to do with. Her old television and variety show performances still circulate today, and it's easy to see why audiences were so taken with her. The energy and confidence are unmistakable, even decades later. The Serta commercials remain a small but genuine piece of American pop culture memory. Cry Baby introduced her to a new generation of film fans. Her earlier films are still there for anyone who wants to judge her talent for themselves. We'll never know exactly how far her film career would have gone without the Rensel scandal hanging over it. Maybe she becomes one of the defining leading ladies of the era. Maybe things play out differently in some other way entirely. What isn't really in question, though, is that the talent was real, the opportunity was real, and the thing that got in the way of it wasn't anything she did. Joey Heatherton had, by her mid-20s, built almost everything a performer needs to become a lasting star: skill, presence, momentum, and a growing body of serious work. Then one man's crime, committed without her knowledge and without her consent, rewrote the terms of her career overnight, even though she was never anything but a bystander to it. Was she simply caught in the fallout of a marriage gone wrong, or did Hollywood apply a standard to her that it never would have applied to a man in the same position? That's the question her story leaves behind, and it's one worth sitting with.